Okay, we're continuing with the book Holy Grail of Wisdom Quotes by me, Pete Rogers. And, I added some things in. These are not in the original book, all these photographs and stuff. There were no photographs in the original book, but I just added them in because I was sort of interested in Ernest Hemingway lately. So, Ernest Hemingway grew up in the Chicago area. He was only 18 years old in 1918, and he volunteered to serve in World War I as an ambulance driver. It was all voluntarily. He was a very brave guy. In high school, by the way, he had been a very good athlete. He was in boxing and football, and he had some episodes of head trauma. All through his life, he had a lot of injuries because he's always doing dangerous things. So then he goes to World War I. He's an ambulance driver, and he was very brave. He was wounded by a mortar, and he then carried another man to safety. While he had wounded with shrapnel in his leg, he carried another man on his shoulders to safety and saved his life. And in so doing, he was then also shot by a machine gun bullet. And so he had some pretty severe injuries. On the battlefield, they thought he was going to die. The priest gave him his last rites, and although he was raised Protestant by his parents, he converted to Catholicism. He said that he felt his soul leave his body and then come back to him. Okay, and he was an intense, very Catholic for a while after that. Here's a picture of him as a young man. So he was a very, handsome, strong, good-looking guy. Very much so an alpha male. Here's a picture of him as one of the members of the Lost Generation. That's Ernest Hemingway here. That's his wife, Hadley. I'm going to talk some more about the Lost Generation and what that means. Gertrude Stein is the one who coined the term. You guys are all a Lost Generation. And after World War II, there was a lot of confusion and sadness because the old ideals, like of the ancient Greeks, of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the ancient Romans with the Aeneid, the idea of one man being an individualistic hero who makes a big difference, felt somewhat shattered because, in World War I, what is one man going to do on no man's land in the trenches, all with machine guns across the field? It's sort of like, what can you do? And they were shocked by the high numbers of casualties. And the whole thing was very disillusioning. I mean, World War I was basically almost like a suicide attempt of Europe. It was insane. It was stupid. Okay. And we'll come back to the Lost Generation writers. Now, here's his first wife, Hadley, like in the 1920s, and they had a child together. And she screwed up. She lost one of his books, the entire book, including the carbon copies of it, a novel. And he just had a hard time forgiving her, and they got divorced. It was a big deal. Then he married another lady, Pauline Pfeiffer, and had a couple more kids. And he loved doing macho things. He always wanted to go, and he lived in Key West, Florida for a while. By this time, he was a famous writer, and he loved going on hunting and fishing adventures. He would go to Africa for safaris. He would try to catch a big fish. He was always trying to do something dramatic. He goes to Spain to chase the bulls in Pamplona. And he had a lot of problems. He was starting to drink more and more. He had car accidents, repeated episodes of head trauma. Later on in Africa and other places, he had some plane crashes where he almost died, of course, and he had more head trauma. The kids loved him when he had time for them, but when he wasn't with the kids, they're just with their mom. He was just doing his own thing, and he sort of drifted more into alcoholism. I'm showing you all these pictures of his life because it's important to understand who he was, to make sense out of his life. He went and volunteered to go in World War II, okay, and he was a World War II correspondent. He did some brave, heroic things. He saved the life of some of his friends that he had known since the days of the Lost Generation. He risked his own life. He was awarded medals for bravery in World War II. The guy was a freaking hero. I mean, he was a hero from top to bottom. It was in his blood to be a hero. So that's why I like the guy, even though there's a lot of other things about him that I don't like. You can tell by this time, he was already pretty messed up by the time around the end of World War II. He was getting more and more unhealthy. He was an alcoholic. This is his fourth wife. He's a tall, good-looking guy, and the women would throw themselves at his feet. But he would keep screwing up. He couldn't stay still in one place. Every time he'd be with a new woman, he'd move to a new place. He ended up moving then to Cuba, back to the United States. And, he was really falling apart after World War II. And the biggest problem was that he was an alcoholic. Alcoholics have lots of accidents. They're always falling down and getting hurt or getting into car accidents and other problems. So, he sort of, the way I feel about it, was an extremely talented guy, but he destroyed himself. Let's see what else here. Like I said, he was like an attention deficit adventure junkie, always trying to go to some next big physical adventure. And that made him interesting and entertaining. And yes, he was very brave and heroic, but by the end, he'd had like 8 or 9 episodes of significant head trauma. Head trauma patients are at increased risk for suicide. The risks for suicide are basically atheism, multiple episodes of head trauma, transgender surgery, and those antidepressant medications. They increase the rate of suicide, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Those medicines are all BS. They don't work. Same thing with the tricyclic antidepressants, Okay, Hemingway, of course, was most famous for his prose style of writing short sentences. We're going to come back to that. I put in yellow highlighting everything that especially relates to his writing. A lot of the other stuff is just his biography or lines from his books. Okay, so he was a very famous member of the Lost Generation. My opinion of the Lost Generation, I don't like them very much. I think for the most part they suck and they're overrated. And give me a chance, I'll explain that. What I'm trying to say is I like a writer who had difficulties in life, like we all do, and they figured out how to overcome them. So I like Hemingway for being a hero, but I'll come back to Hemingway. But what I'm trying to say is, to me, a great writer is like, Dostoevsky getting out of the gulag, camp, being nearly executed and coming back and being this magnificent writer. I admire that. I love a writer like Victor Hugo. He comes out of exile, writes his masterpiece, Les Miserables. I love guys that had all these difficulties but overcame them. Okay? I don't like, James Joyce. His book, Ulysses, it's a bit crazy. Yeah, I like the idea of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but James Joyce was a pathetic alcoholic atheist, and he sort of destroyed himself, and his books are largely, Ulysses is unreadable. I tried reading it a couple times, I'm a freaking genius, and I couldn't read it because it was so annoying. It was like the effort wasn't worth it for what you get back, Show me some great insight. I don't, it's not there. Okay, William Faulkner is another alcoholic. These are these lost generators. And then the other one they talk about is Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf is a piece of crap, okay? She was constantly trying to commit suicide, and finally she did. Somebody who thinks that life is meaningless and worthless and it's not worth living, they're not a good role model. They have nothing to say to me. If that's your opinion of life, then, then I have nothing to learn from you, okay? Picasso was a complete scum, another lost generation scumbag, communist, evil piece of crap. What I'm trying to say is they all sucked, okay? T.S. Eliot, at least he was a better person, and he did some things to preserve traditional literature, and he loved Dante, but his poetry sucked, okay? Ezra Pound, I couldn't make any sense out of his poetry. It's like, where's your meaning, okay? I want a writer that teaches me something useful. There was one guy who was a little bit on the tail end of this group, Tom Wolfe. He was a great writer, okay? He wrote some great books, okay? Let's see, but, he celebrated, the Christian idea, and he talks about what a joke evolutionary theory is, okay? All right, let's continue on here now with alcoholism. Really was the biggest destroying thing for Hemingway. I mean, he just was a disgusting alcoholic. He was a fat, sick alcoholic, and he was a little bit of a chump for some of the commie propaganda. They still have a statue of him in Cuba, okay, and he was sometimes on the wrong side of the deal when he was in Spain. He went there for the Spanish Civil War, the 1930s testing ground for what was going to happen later, World War II. He initially, raised Protestant, was a little bit anti-Catholic, but like I said, afterwards he was a Catholic then for the rest of his life, and he had a more intense conversion ceremony when before he was getting married to his second wife. Most of his novels, of course, are set in Catholic countries. He raised all three of his sons as Catholics. He didn't want to be known as a Catholic writer because he felt that it was too hard for him to be a good example because he knew he was an alcoholic. He did pray every day. He often went to church. Let's see. Now, a couple things, he says, my words. If you want to learn how to write, you got to be interesting. One of the reasons why most people can't write is, number one, they don't know how to write well. But number two, it's because they're boring. They haven't done anything interesting. They don't know anything interesting. If you want to be a good writer, go have some adventures. Study something intensely so you become a high-level expert in it, okay? Watch comedians and people who are entertaining so you'll become more entertaining. I mean, I think of writing as infotainment, information and entertainment, okay? And in my opinion, the best way to write is like you're talking to an intelligent friend, because what do you do with your friend? You try to make them laugh. You try to tell them something you think is interesting, okay? And that's good prose. And there's no sense bothering about anyone else because anyone else isn't going to like you anyway, so don't worry about catering to them. Okay, well, Hemingway did tons of interesting things. Volunteering for World War I, volunteering for World War II, living in Paris, living in Spain, traveling on safaris to Africa, living in Florida, Cuba, traveling to China. He was always doing something kind of wild and crazy, and also getting himself into a lot of mischief with the ladies. 4 wives, several other big affairs, etc. He learned how to write prose by writing short stories, and you could make a living in those days writing short stories for the magazines. He also worked as a journalist, and a journalist is taught to write short sentences, short paragraphs, get to the point. And so he knew all that, even though a lot of the newspapers, of course, are owned by the lefties and they destroy everything. But, back in those days, it wasn't as bad as it is nowadays. Hemingway became known as the polar opposite on the spectrum of writing types. With Hemingway, short declarative sentences, tough and terse prose, in comparison with Faulkner, the babbling alcoholic fool who wrote these real long sentences, so-called, purple prose, a throwback to Victorian novels where people had nothing else to do but read, read, read. Hemingway, I think, is a much better writer than Faulkner. Okay, I think Faulkner is totally overrated and a bit of a wuss. Hemingway at least was a tough guy and a hero. Let's see. Okay, here's Hemingway. Everything in highlighting is about writing. The first draft of anything is shit. There is no such thing as great writing. There is only great rewriting. Yeah, the first draft is like a stream of consciousness. You just get it down on paper, and then you organize it better after that. It's a good idea to do a mind map before you start writing so you at least have a plan. As Schopenhauer said, so few people think before they start to write. You make a mind map, that's good. You don't want to make an outline because then you'll get writer's block because you can't force yourself to put it in order when you don't fully understand the material yet. So you make a mind map and then you just let it flow. Okay, Hemingway, good writing is good conversation. The writer's job is to tell the truth. That's an important point. Good writers, it resonates as being true. That's why a lot of these modern books stink. They're written by ghostwriters and then put under the famous person's name. And ghostwriting really exists. When I was a young guy in my 30s, I dated a lady who was a ghostwriter. And she took me to the bookstore, and she would point to the names of some of these really famous best-selling authors. And she was pointing to the books that she wrote. She was paid to write books that were then put under their name so people would buy them. Okay, and that's more common than people think, and that's why you'll notice like some guy who wrote a good book that was popular then becomes like a best-selling famous author, and their later books suck. It's almost like, what happened to this guy? Sometimes it's because they get older and they have cerebral vascular atherosclerosis, mercury toxicity to their brain from amalgams, and they just suck. They can't write anymore. Okay, but a lot of times it's because they just have ghostwriters writing their books to make money, and they don't care about their legacy. Okay, Hemingway continues. The best way with writing is always to stop when you're going good and when you know what will happen next. If you do that every day when you are writing a novel, you will never get stuck. That way, your subconscious will work on it all the time. When I am working on a book or a story, I write every morning as soon after first light as possible. Yeah, we're smarter in the morning because our brain cleans itself at night. The glymphatic system, all the neurons pump out their waste products. You have to do it at night while you're asleep because your brain can't go offline in the daytime while you're awake. So at night, the perivascular spaces of Virchow Robin around the neurons open up, cerebral spinal fluid rinses over the neurons, and they toss out their waste products. So in the morning, you're as smart as it gets. Plus, you get a little cortisol surge and catecholamine surge, just the right amount to be smart. Because when does an animal need to be smart? When it's hungry, when it first wakes up in the morning. Break fast after fasting overnight. Okay, Hemingway continues. I never had to choose a subject. My subject chose me. The educated man is the man who can do something. The quality of his work marks the degree of his education. By the way, Hemingway never went to college. And all this college stuff is kind of a big joke, okay? Back in the day, in the 1800s, a lot of the absolutely smartest people, they just were homeschooled and educated themselves, okay? What the heck does anybody remember from grade school or high school? You've got people who are homeschooled like, Oscar Wilde. He learns a whole bunch of languages, while he's at home, all right? I wish if I could live my life over again, you bet I would homeschool myself. I could learn so much faster than the nonsense they teach at the grade schools and the high schools. Okay, there was a little bit of a feud and a comparison between him and Faulkner. Okay, well, actually, one more quote. He says, I know only that what is moral is what you feel good after, and what is immoral is what you feel bad after. A lot of times, too, that relates to the spirit of the law or the letter of the law. And, the important thing is the spirit of the law. Okay, here's his little writing feud with Faulkner. He says, poor Faulkner, because Faulkner had said that Hemingway only uses baby words. You never have to use a dictionary when you read Hemingway. Hemingway responded, poor Faulkner, does he really think big emotions come from big words? He thinks I don't know the $10 words. I know them all right, but there are older and simpler and better words, and those are the ones I choose. Okay, Hemingway, in order to write about life, you first must live it. Dostoevsky was made by being sent to Siberia. Writers are forged as a sword is forged. And I think that's a great quote because I recently made a video just a couple days ago about the best writers having been in exile, because it's during that time of exile, instead of just working, like a wage slave in a standard local environment where you have to conform to some extent, they get some free time to really think. And from a different perspective, like Cicero when he was exiled to Greece, okay? Thucydides when he was exiled from Athens. I went through all that stuff before, but most of the absolutely best writers went through a phase of being ostracized or exiled or imprisoned or having grown up in two different places, so they had a double perspective that made their writing unique and perceptive. Okay, Hemingway continues, the most essential gift for a good writer is a built-in shock-proof bullshit detector. This is the writer's radar, and all great writers have had it. The next thing he says is you lose if you talk about it, meaning that, if you're working on a project, let's say a book or something, you don't want to talk about it too much because you'll almost get a feeling of completion or satisfaction that you haven't really earned yet, and that can make you lazy. A big part of writing a book is you have to have this intense determination. It can help if you're, just like he said about a writer is sort of made from recovering from injustice. They're pissed off and they want to put it down on paper. You need that energy because it's a lot of work. You got to make yourself get up early in the morning, crank all day. Okay, the most essential gift for a good writer is a built-in shock-proof bullshit detector. That's the writer's radar, and all the great ones have had it. For a true writer, each book should be a new beginning. Yeah, a good writer, they're willing to take on challenges. They don't just keep the same wimpy formula to get more sales for the publisher, what the publisher wants. If you're doing what the publisher wants, then you're going to be a wimpy writer. Okay, Hemingway says, he should always try for something that has never been done or for something that others have failed. Okay, Hemingway continues, I believe that basically you write for two people. You write for yourself to try and make it perfect, and then you write for those who you love. Yeah, like talking to an intelligent friend or people you care about. Okay, Hemingway continues, when people talk, most never listen, nor do they observe. You should be able to go into a room and when you come out of it, know everything that you saw there. And not only that, if the room gave you any feeling, you should know exactly what it was that gave you that feeling. Always think of other people. Okay, that's a good Hemingway quote, and that, of course, reminds me of Tolstoy. Now, Tolstoy, by the way, had, like Nabokov said, he had a fundamental accuracy of perception. Tolstoy could describe a scene like Vronsky traveling in a carriage with Anna Karenina and feeling his calf and looking out at the beautiful sunshine in the woods, and you feel like you're there, which is great. But Tolstoy had no moral foundation, okay? I think he thought he was God himself. Excuse me, the more you learn about Tolstoy, he's an asshole. All right, I just tell you that because Hemingway's a little bit like that. Pretty good accuracy of description, and his brief writing style became famous and something worth learning. But he himself, Hemingway also, because of his alcoholism, is afraid to publicly be Catholic. There's not like this big overwhelming point. I don't think any of Hemingway's books are that great, okay? I'm not that big a fan of Hemingway. I can't help liking him, coming from Chicago area and stuff, and being an athlete, and being such a brave hero and an American. So I like him, but I sort of feel like he was very underachieved. Yeah, he was famous, but he really didn't do, in terms of literature, he didn't leave, I don't think, any really great legacy. He left a style. Okay, Hemingway continues. He says, the farther you go in writing, the more alone you are. Writing's a lonely business. You're sitting by yourself at your desk. Imagination, it is the one thing besides honesty that a good writer must have. The more he learns from experience, the more he can imagine. Worry destroys the ability to write. As long as you can start, you are all right. The juice will come. Intelligence is so damn rare, and the people who have it often have such a bad time with it that they get bitter, and then it's not much use. I'm always reading books. If you want to be a writer, you have to be a reader. You have to, immerse yourself in words. It's obvious. Okay, I'm always reading books. Details make stories human, and the more human the story can be, the better. The hardest thing to do is to write straight, honest prose on human beings. First, you have to know the subject. Then you have to know how to write. Both take a lifetime to learn. Okay, then just quotes from his book. I'm with you no matter what else you have in your head. I'm with you and I love you. Okay. The best people possess a feeling for beauty, the courage to take risks, the discipline to tell the truth, and the capacity for sacrifice. Ironically, their virtues make them vulnerable. They are often wounded and sometimes destroyed. The hardest lesson I've had to learn as an adult is the relentlessness needed to keep going, no matter how shattered I feel inside. Yeah, that's important for everybody, because a lot of times you're getting screwed over on one or more things, you're getting treated unfairly, you're pissed off, you're sad, you're disappointed, you're tired. But if you're doing something good, you got to just keep doing it, no matter what, And that's kind of like my attitude. I said, I'm good. I know I'm right about all this medical stuff. I'm going to write my books. Even if nobody reads them, I don't care. I know I'm right. I'm just going to do it. Next thing, Hemingway says, the good parts of a book may be only something a writer is lucky enough to overhear, or it might be the wreck of his whole damn life, and one is as good as another for putting into his books. Hemingway, now is no time to think of what you do not have. Think of what you can do with what there is. The world breaks everyone, and afterwards, many are strongest in the broken places. So, that is the tribute video to Ernest Hemingway, an American hero who sadly destroyed himself with alcoholism, but he was still a heroic guy, and he left a magnificent writing style that's worth knowing. So anyways, hope you found that helpful and interesting.